Welcome to the Gary Null Show, a program designed to enhance mental, physical, and spiritual well-being through science and the wisdom of the ages. Let us take you on a journey of empowerment. Sit back, relax, and get ready to change your life for good.
Hi everyone, I'm Gary Null. I'd like to welcome you to the Gary Null Show. Last week we began part 1 of Fatal Fallout, all about nuclear proliferation, pros and cons. Let's continue watching that now.
These reactors are run by very large utility companies, among them Exelon, Entergy, Dominion, and so forth. They not just make money, but these companies are heavy contributors to political parties, especially to the Republican Party.
How do we know how dangerous radiation really is? We know this by looking at actual case studies. Back in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, people were radiation happy. They got radioactive radium, X-rays for all sorts of ailments. They were exposed to criminally high levels of radiation. Then, of course, large numbers of them came down with cancer. So by looking at the amount of radiation given to women who were pregnant, people that had X-rays to the spinal cord, X-rays to the face to treat acne and other kinds of problems, we can now calculate how dangerous radiation was. However, there's a problem. The Hiroshima data is data on hundreds of thousands of Japanese. That outweighed all the other data. The Hiroshima data seemed to indicate that the effects of radiation were exaggerated. And all the radiation studies were done on the basis of Hiroshima data. Now we know the reason why there was a mismatch. The Hiroshima data itself was miscalibrated. By looking at the neutron levels and gamma ray levels, we now know there was a miscalibration between the neutrons and the gamma rays. Now we know that the two levels of radiation are the same. Radiation is perhaps 2 to 5 times more dangerous than we previously thought when we first began to set radiation regulations on workers and the general public. At Hiroshima, it was basically the healthy Japanese who survived. The ones who were weak, the ones who were already sick, they died even before the doctors could come to analyze the effects of radiation. It was basically the Japanese who were already robust, already healthy with a vibrant immune system. They lived long enough to be recorded by the American doctors at Hiroshima. And so for all these reasons, we now begin to realize that the granddaddy of all radiation studies, the studies done at Hiroshima, were in fact miscalibrated. There's a myth that no one has ever died in a nuclear accident. That's remarkable, because I have the autopsies of many of the Americans who died in catastrophic nuclear accidents in the United States. In the weapons program, for example, at Los Alamos, there were 2 workers that were playing with hemispheres of plutonium, and the hemispheres came too close, and essentially a small atomic bomb went off right in their chest. They were exposed to about 5,000 rads of radiation right after the bombing of Nagasaki in 1945 and 1946. Their bodies were exposed to so much radiation that their bodies almost disintegrated at the Los Alamos Hospital. Pictures of them, autopsy pictures I have, showing that yes, American workers at nuclear plants have died horribly in nuclear accidents, all of which were covered up. In 1961, at the SL-1 reactor in Idaho Falls, Idaho, there was a Navy reactor which exploded when a worker took out the control rod. 3 workers died horribly in that accident. 1 worker had a control rod that went right up his groin, came out his shoulder, and pinned him on the top of the reactor. That's how explosive a steam explosion was that ripped apart the SL-1 reactor back in 1961 in Idaho Falls, Idaho. So Americans have died in nuclear accidents, but this has been classified, hushed up by the media throughout the Cold War.
This was the time of the Cold War, when China appeared to be overrunning Korea, and when the world was afraid that Russia would not only overrun Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Latvia, but all of Europe. And we had dismantled our armies after World War II. And as a result, the only thing that stood between us and the horror of communism, a dictatorship taking over the world, were the nuclear weapons. And since our government, both on every state and government level, is absolutely convinced that nuclear energy is clean and safe and emits hardly anything compared to medical x-rays, every health official, every government official wants to see nuclear energy, too cheap to meter, to become reality. And that was particularly true 20, 30 years ago. And as an enthusiastic young physicist, I was glad to see the air in Pittsburgh cleaned up. You can't see, you can't smell, you can't taste radioactivity, but you can see the smoke belching out and the snow turning black. So it seemed to us that radiation is by far the best way to go. But I have to admit, it never occurred to me that anybody would allow radioactivity from escaping from a nuclear plant. If the American public had learned that even a bomb dropped on Russia or China would lead to fallout that would circulate the globe and come back here to haunt us, to damage our newborn especially, and to endanger the survival of a healthy society, if the public had been aware of this, then we would have lost the value of the threat of nuclear weapons.
One of the shameful tragedies of the Cold War has been the fact that the media consistently looked the other way when it was obvious that there were cover-ups going on. It now turns out that the media was in fact aware of the fact that radiation was being dispersed secretly into populated areas, but people hushed up because they said this is national security. It would be treasonous. It would be unpatriotic if the American people were given this information that their own government was using their bodies as guinea pigs for the Cold War. As a consequence, it's one of the shameful episodes in our history that the glare of media that the public trusts and demands to have an enlightened electorate, was not shown on the nuclear industry.
There is a reason why major news networks don't cover stories on routine operations of nuclear reactors and exposure to low doses of radiation. And I think there's no better example than to take two of the four major networks in this country. One is CBS, which for years was owned by Westinghouse, and the other is NBC, which for years was owned by General Electric. Now, Westinghouse and General Electric manufactured probably about 90% of the nuclear reactors that are used in this country and worldwide. I think it would be quite a difficult thing for a company like CBS or NBC to air stories like that, knowing full well that if this information got out to the public, they would be admitting that their own companies, in fact, manufacture these machines that are harming or even killing people. So I think there's a great bias there. In the 1950s, Americans were scared. They were scared of a nuclear war that could perhaps wipe out millions of Americans, in fact, if not the whole world. And they were also scared about the fallout that was getting into their bodies from the atomic bomb tests in Nevada.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt this program to bring you important news. Word has just been received from the Atomic Energy Commission that due to a change in wind direction, the residue from this morning's atomic detonation is drifting in the direction of St. George. It is suggested that everyone remain indoors for 1 hour or until further notice. There is no danger. This is simply routine Atomic Energy Commission safety procedure. To prevent unnecessary exposure to radiation, it is better to take cover during this period. Parents need not be alarmed about children at school.
Yes, we must all get ready now, so we know how to save ourselves if the atomic bomb ever explodes near us. If you do not know just what to do, ask your teacher when this film is over. Discuss what you could do in different places if a bomb explodes. Older people will help us as they always do, but there might not be any grown-ups around when the bomb explodes. Then, you're on your own.
Remember what to do, friends. Now tell me right out loud. What are you supposed to do when you see the flash? Duck and cover. Duck and cover. Duck and cover.
When Dwight Eisenhower became president, and in September 1953, he went to the United Nations and gave what was called the Atoms for Peace speech. And in it, Eisenhower acknowledged that, yes, nuclear weapons are a terrible threat to humanity, but in addition, we have to understand that the atom can be used for peaceful purposes. It can be used for medical purposes, and it could also be used to generate electricity.
The United States pledges before you, and therefore before the world, its determination to help solve the fearful atomic dilemma, to devote its entire heart and mind to find the way by which the miraculous inventiveness of man shall not be dedicated to his death, but consecrated to his life.
This was a means of, in effect, trying to assuage people, to calm them down about these terrible fears they had. And while certainly we can and do produce electricity using nuclear reactors, there were three questions back then that were unanswered. First of all, can we guarantee that there will not be a major accident and a major meltdown at a reactor? Second of all, are these low levels of radiation that routinely come out of the reactors, can we assume that they're harmless? And three, what do we do with all the nuclear waste that is generated? 50 years ago, those questions were unanswered, and today, those questions are still unanswered.
Nevada Test Site, 1957. The plumb bob statistics can be recited briefly. This was the 6th Continental Test Series. 30 detonations were set off early April to early October, among which were several non-nuclear safety tests. There were 43 military effects projects carried out by 21 government laboratories and agencies.
Many experiments have been carried out on laboratory animals for many decades that show that small amounts of radiation cause newborn babies, newborn young of every species, dogs and every kind of animal, to have underweight birth and babies that die very quickly after birth. And the same pattern has been seen now in the United States and all around the world for humans. There was a steady decline since about 1935, and suddenly in the early 50s it ended and began actually to rise in the late 50s when there was a large amount of fallout coming down. And as soon as the last bomb test took place in the United States and Britain and the USSR in 1962, there was a dramatic decline in the number of babies that died, both of infections and cancer. Although we're constantly exposed to environmental pollutants, the body normally fights off early cancer cells, and when we lose this ability to fight cancer cells and infections, that's when the death rates and the disease rates have gone up.
I got breast cancer in the summer of '99. I was trying to find out what made Connecticut #1 for breast cancer. What risk factors did we have that the rest of the country didn't have? And I heard Burton Goldberg, who is a very big co-author and author of several alternative books on cancer and heart disease. He was describing how the breast cancer rate went down dramatically after the nuclear reactor near Sacramento was shut down. And I jumped right on it to look at Indian Point, which I found out was 25 miles from my home in New Canaan, Connecticut. I began to talk with people at riverkeeper.org, Bobby Kennedy's group, who was trying to shut down Indian Point on the basis of what if the terrorists come. My personal feeling is that the terrorists have already struck. It's our own government for allowing a nuclear reactor to leak and not shut it down permanently.
Infant mortality, childhood cancers, and breast cancers are much greater for people living within about 30 to 50 miles around these plants, and especially in the areas that tend to be downwind to the north and northeast of these plants.
The prevalence of breast cancer in Connecticut begs the question, why? Why Connecticut? And that begs the question of causation, and if there are causes in the environment, for example, low-level radiation, it begs the question of prevention. What can be done to improve the situation? Does that mean better containment? Does it mean stronger evacuation zones in the event of a crisis? So what a governor ought to be doing is saying, if there is this issue, and finding the experts and getting the information out there to prove the case, then following through means being willing to stand up to the special interests and say, we've got a real problem here, we need to deal with it, we have an obligation to the women of Connecticut to deal with it.
Although breast cancer is higher in white women than in African American women, what we're finding is that the breast cancer deaths are higher in African American women, and the African American women are getting breast cancer at younger ages than whites. Breast cancer is still increasing. It's still a major issue, and we know that the environment contributes a lot to breast cancer.
Low-level radiation acts in many ways on the body, depending on the particular chemical that's involved. Some 100 chemicals are produced in nuclear fission. Among them are those that seek out the bone, like strontium-90, which is similar chemically to ordinary calcium, which we need to build the bone. And so the strontium-90 goes along with the milk into the body, and we end up with strontium-90 in the bone. Now, ordinarily, we used to think that that will only give us bone cancer. Unfortunately, the electrons or beta rays, which are emitted from the center of a nucleus, are able to reach a tiny distance into the bone marrow, and that's where the stem cells of the immune system are formed. That's where all the cells of the blood, the white and red cells, are born, and they can be slightly mutated, and as a result they can either die or become abnormal in their function, and as a result the whole immune system of the human body is affected by very tiny doses of strontium-90. People used to believe that a millirad is a millirad, whether it comes from an X-ray or strontium-90 or God knows what. The important point is that it is not the same. An X-ray is external and only reaches a part of the body generally. You know, when I just had a recent dental X-ray or a chest. But what happens when you inhale or ingest radioactive particles like strontium-90 or strontium-89, barium-140, all these chemical elements that are similar to calcium go to all the bone marrow from the head to your toe and irradiate every aspect of the immune system all over the body. Furthermore, instead of doing it in a short flash of a second, it does it gradually. And it turns out in 1972, a Canadian scientist by the name of Abram Petcott discovered that if you stretch out a given amount of radiation over time, it produces a much stronger effect than a short X-ray. Because a medical X-ray occurs in a short time, you get hundreds of thousands of free radicals bumping into each other like people in a crowded nightclub. Nobody can get to the door if I yell fire. But if there's only one or two people in the room and I yell fire, they all get out. And the same thing is true for the immune system. So if I have a cell of the immune system being attacked by free radicals, it takes only a single free radical to puncture the skin of the cell like a balloon, like a pinprick. And you know that if I throw 1,000 darts at a balloon, it will destroy the balloon no more than if I throw a single dart. And that is why protracted, low-dose, low-level radiation, internal, ingested, and inhaled, is so much more deadly by factors of 100 to 1,000-fold.
Nuclear power plants are licensed to routinely release radioactive material, and they can release each chemical is measured up to the limit of giving the general public the ICRP recommended dose in a year. So it's set up so that it's legal to emit these radionuclides into the air and into the water. Probably from a normally operating plant, except for people with already established breathing problems, your main problem would be the food chain. So if you have contaminated the soil, for example, it will be picked up in the fruit trees or the vegetables that are planted. Someone could be miles away and they could receive this radioactive pollution in their food.
Back in 1963, President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty. Everyone thought peace was at hand in 1963.
Even then, the number of children and grandchildren with cancer in their bones, with leukemia in their blood, or with poison in their lungs might seem statistically small to some in comparison with natural health hazards. But this is not a natural health hazard, and it is not a statistical issue. The loss of even one human life, or the malformation of even one baby, who may be born long after all of us have gone, should be of concern to us all.
The Ban the Bomb movement, a very powerful movement, totally disintegrated as people rejoiced, saying the nuclear arms race is over. Wrong. Testing went from above ground to underground, about one a week, in fact, in terms of nuclear tests. And the bombs went from first-generation bombs, huge, gigantic bombs, to second-generation atomic and nuclear bombs, small nuclear weapons about this big. You could pack 10 of them in the nose cone of an MX missile. So the Limited Test Ban Treaty, in some sense, was a farce. It limited above-ground testing, but it gave us the MIRV, multiply integrated warheads, a ferocious first-strike weapon.
The government has had to make us believe that the radiation emitted, either from the bomb tests or from the normally permitted releases from nuclear plants, are so low that they could not result in detectable effects on human health. And that is an outright lie, because study after study for the last 4 or 5 decades have shown that people living near nuclear reactors or downwind from the bomb test site had much higher incidence of diseases and death than people living elsewhere. And all this has been available for decades, and it was kept from the public because of the need to use and threaten the use of nuclear weapons.
Near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, an accident at a nuclear power plant. A spokesman said that a feed water pump broke down this morning, automatically shutting down the 3-mile nuclear power plant. Some radiated steam escaped into the atmosphere before the plant could be sealed off, but officials said there is no threat to health.
The tragedy of 3 Mile Island was, of course, that it did not explode in a visible way the way Chernobyl did. Then everyone would have been warned and people would have evacuated and so on. But instead it was a gradual, part meltdown that didn't go all the way Chernobyl did. And as a result, radioactive gases came out, but not so instantly, and there was no fire to warn people. And as a result, the governor hesitated for a few days to order evacuation of pregnant women and children, which I had recommended at the time when I was there together with George Wald on the day after the accident. I urged women and children to leave, but many didn't because you couldn't smell it. You couldn't see it. And the utility lied about it. They didn't want to admit that they had a major meltdown. And that caused many more children all over the Northeast, in Pennsylvania, New York, and all the way up to England, to New England, and across to Europe and Wales and England, to be affected by the radioactive gases that have silently escaped. And nobody died at 3 Mile Island, according to the government.
There's a controversy about 3 Mile Island. Some people say that you can see an increase in birth defects, an increase in spontaneous abortions. Other people say no such thing. Almost no radiation came out of 3 Mile Island, and therefore it's just anecdotal data.
Every effort will be made to keep those radiation levels down to the present state, which is quite safe for all concerned.
The truth of the matter is, we don't really know. We know, for example, that about 13 million curies of xenon gas came out of that reactor.
The radiation levels are being very carefully monitored throughout the area.
More to come next week. I'll see you then.